A racist police officer sees a black man and automatically assumes he is a criminal, so he immediately starts to harass the man, eventually punching him. He is shocked when the black man punches him back. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks of Meadowcrest Heights. Jamal Carter pulled the last of his tools from the front yard he'd been working on all day. The house behind him, a modern glass-fronted masterpiece, belonged to one of his longtime clients, who appreciated his craftsmanship. He wiped his brow, slinging his tool belt over one shoulder, and began the short walk to his truck parked just down the block. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. He felt the weight of eyes on him, though the windows of the surrounding homes betrayed no movement. He was used to this feeling, the subtle chill that crept in whenever he worked in areas like this, where his presence often felt out of place, despite his professionalism. The low hum of an approaching car broke the silence. A police cruiser crept toward him, its headlights cutting through the encroaching dusk. Jamal slowed his pace as the cruiser pulled alongside him and stopped. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed Jamal with the sharp gaze of someone looking for trouble. "What are you doing around here, buddy? You look out of place," the officer said, his tone cold. Jamal stopped, his stance calm but firm. "Just finished a job," he said, nodding toward his truck. "Heading out." The officer's lip curled slightly, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Got some ID on you? You look like you don't belong here." The words hit like a slap, but Jamal's expression didn't waver. He reached into his pocket slowly and handed over his driver's license. The officer examined it as though searching for something incriminating, then held onto it longer than necessary. "You work around here?" the officer pressed. Jamal glanced at the tools in his hand. "I think that's obvious." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone." Jamal exhaled through his nose. He could feel the tension building, the unspoken power dynamic shifting. He wasn't in the mood to play along today. Jamal crossed his arms, watching as the officer, his name badge read Bradley, lingered over the ID like it was a secret code he hadn't yet cracked. Bradley's posture was deliberate, designed to intimidate, but Jamal remained unshaken. Years of navigating moments like this had trained him to maintain a calm exterior, even as frustration boiled beneath the surface. "So, Mr. Carter," Bradley said, dragging out the words as though savoring their weight, "what kind of work do you do around here?" "Carpentry," Jamal replied flatly. He nodded toward the yard behind him. "Finished a custom deck for that house." Bradley's eyes flicked toward the house, his skepticism palpable. "You got a permit for that job?" Jamal blinked. "I don't need one. I'm contracted by the homeowner." The officer smirked, a thin line of condescension spreading across his face. "Uh-huh. And you just decided to take a little stroll afterward? That it?" Jamal squared his shoulders. "I'm walking to my truck. Is there a problem with that?" Bradley took a step closer, the weight of his presence more oppressive than the humid evening air. "Depends," he said slowly. "You look nervous. Got anything you're not supposed to have?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "No. Mind if I take a look at your truck then? Just to be sure." There it was. The push. The overstep. Jamal glanced at his truck a few yards away, then back at Bradley. "I mind," he said, his tone firm. "You've got no reason to search my vehicle." Bradley's smirk disappeared, replaced by a hard edge. "Now why would you say that? Unless you've got something to hide." Jamal let out a sharp breath, stepping back slightly. "Because I know my rights." For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Bradley's hand hovered near his baton. Jamal saw it, the subtle movement designed to instill fear, to make him second-guess standing his ground. "Let me explain how this works," Bradley said, his voice lowering, laced with menace. "I ask, you comply. That's the smart thing to do." Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not breaking any laws, so unless you've got a reason to detain me, I'm leaving." Bradley's face hardened. His voice rose just enough to carry down the street. "Don't test me, son. You're real close to getting yourself into trouble." Jamal's eyes flicked toward the houses. Curtains twitched. Shadows moved behind windows. He wasn't alone, but no one would step in. They never did. Bradley shifted his stance, now blocking Jamal's path to his truck. "You think you're smart, huh? Walking away like that? Smart enough to know what this is," Jamal shot back. "You think you can intimidate me because you've got that badge?" Bradley stepped closer, the air between them charged with tension. "That badge means you listen to me." Jamal clenched his fists, every muscle in his body taut. "It means you're supposed to protect and serve, not harass people for no reason." The officer's smirk returned, colder than before. "And I'm supposed to believe you're not hiding anything? You've got a chip on your shoulder, Carter. Don't be surprised when it gets you in trouble." "You're the one looking for trouble," Jamal countered. "But you're not gonna find it here." The tension hung heavy, the balance of power teetering dangerously. Jamal's calm facade remained intact, but the fire in his eyes told a different story. Bradley's hand inched toward his belt, his fingers brushing against the baton. Jamal noticed the movement, his breath steady, but his pulse racing. The sound of the baton sliding free from Bradley's belt cut through the tense silence like a warning. Jamal's eyes locked on the weapon, his body instinctively tensing. Bradley spun the baton slowly in his hand, his smirk deepening as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You're resisting an officer's orders," Bradley said, his tone dripping with false authority. "That's enough reason for me to do what I need to do." Jamal held his ground, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm not resisting anything. You don't have a reason to stop me." Bradley tilted his head, the smirk never leaving his face. "You're not in charge here, Carter. That's the problem with guys like you. You think you can just walk away." Jamal exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking to the houses where curtains shifted and shadows moved behind windows. A couple of people had stepped onto their porches, cautiously watching the scene unfold. Phones began appearing, cameras pointed toward the confrontation, but it didn't stop Bradley. "You just want me to react," Jamal said, his voice calm but cutting. "So you can do what you've already decided to do." "Don't flatter yourself," Bradley spat. "You think I'm scared of you?" "No," Jamal replied evenly, "but you're scared of being wrong. And you're scared of being on camera right now." That comment hit a nerve. Bradley's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think this is a joke?" he snapped, raising the baton slightly. "Let's see how funny it is when you're on the ground." "Try it," Jamal said, his tone low. "Let everyone here see exactly who you are." Bradley's face darkened, his hand tightening around the baton. Without warning, he swung it toward Jamal's side. Jamal moved instinctively, raising his arm to block the blow. Pain shot through his forearm, but he held firm, grabbing the baton with his free hand and yanking it from Bradley's grasp. He flung it to the ground with a loud clatter that echoed down the street. The crowd gasped audibly. Phones were recording now, capturing every second. Bradley, visibly stunned by Jamal's response, stumbled back a step, his chest heaving. The officer's face contorted with rage, his hand balling into a fist. "You're gonna regret that," Bradley hissed, stepping forward. Before Jamal could respond, Bradley's fist flew through the air, slamming into his jaw with brutal force. The blow staggered Jamal, sending him back a step as pain exploded through his face. For a moment, his vision blurred, but adrenaline coursed through him, dulling the worst of it. Jamal steadied himself, his eyes blazing with defiance. "That all you got?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. Bradley's expression twisted further, his fury boiling over. "You're done," he growled, charging forward. This time, Jamal didn't hesitate. He swung back, his fist connecting with Bradley's ribs. The impact forced a grunt from the officer, and he doubled over slightly, but Jamal didn't stop. He shoved Bradley hard, sending him sprawling to the pavement. The crowd's murmurs turned into shouts. "Hey, we're filming this!" one voice yelled. Another added, "You can't treat him like that." Bradley scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. He fumbled for his radio, barking into it. "Backup requested. Suspect is resisting arrest and has assaulted an officer." Jamal's chest rose and fell as he stepped back, raising his hands. "You're the one who escalated this, Bradley. Don't try to twist it." The officer's jaw tightened as he charged again. This time, he grabbed Jamal's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Jamal winced, gritting his teeth as Bradley yanked him forward and forced him to the ground. The officer's knee dug into his back, sending sharp pain shooting up Jamal's spine. "Stay down!" Bradley barked, snapping the cuffs onto Jamal's wrists with a loud click. The crowd was in an uproar now. "That's excessive!" one man shouted, his phone aimed squarely at Bradley. "We saw everything." Jamal turned his head slightly, his voice steady despite the pain. "Keep filming," he said, his tone firm. "Don't let him get away with this." Bradley hauled Jamal to his feet, his grip rough and unrelenting. The crowd's shouting grew louder, their accusations cutting through the tension. "You're on camera!" one woman yelled. "We're all going to see what you did." "Good," Bradley shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Make sure you get his little temper tantrum, too." Jamal's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You're not going to talk your way out of this, Bradley." The officer shoved him toward the cruiser, his face flushed with anger. "Get in the car," he snapped. Jamal climbed in without resistance, settling into the back seat as the door slammed shut behind him. Through the window, he could see the faces of the onlookers, their phones still raised. One man held his phone up higher and gave Jamal a nod of encouragement. The cruiser pulled away, its siren blaring as it sped into the night. Jamal leaned back against the seat, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs. His lip throbbed, a trickle of blood staining his shirt. But his mind was sharper than ever. This wasn't over. The drive to the station was tense, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the cruiser. Jamal sat in the back seat, his jaw throbbing and wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. His eyes stayed fixed on Bradley's reflection in the rearview mirror, watching the officer's every move. Bradley's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, but his face betrayed a mix of anger and unease. "You're real quiet now," Jamal said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to his words. "What happened to all that tough talk?" Bradley's eyes flicked up to the mirror, his jaw tightening. "Shut your mouth." "Or what?" Jamal pressed, leaning forward slightly. "You already got your punches in. Gonna try and add another charge while we're here?" "Keep talking," Bradley muttered, his voice low but laced with warning. "You'll see where it gets you." Jamal's lip curled into a humorless smile. "You know what? I think I'll keep talking. Someone's gotta hold you accountable, even if it's just me." "You assaulted an officer," Bradley snapped, his voice louder now. "That's all anyone's gonna care about." "No," Jamal countered, his voice steady. "What they're gonna care about is the video showing you hitting me first. Let's see how that plays out for you." Bradley's grip on the wheel tightened further. He didn't respond immediately, but Jamal could see the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You people always have an excuse," Bradley said finally, his tone bitter. "Always playing the victim." Jamal's jaw tightened. "You mean people like me, right? Say it. Don't dance around it." Bradley's silence was telling. He stared straight ahead, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Here's the thing," Jamal continued. "You can tell yourself whatever you need to sleep at night, but the truth's already out there. All those phones recording? They're gonna show exactly who you are." The cruiser slowed as they neared the station, its flashing lights illuminating the empty parking lot. Bradley pulled into a spot and killed the engine. For a moment, he sat still, staring straight ahead. Then he turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jamal through the barrier separating them. "You think you're special?" he said quietly, his voice venomous. "You think you're gonna bring me down? Let me tell you how this works. People like me. We protect each other. Your little stunt tonight? It's not going anywhere." Jamal leaned back against the seat, his expression calm but defiant. "Not this time. People are watching now, and they're not gonna let you hide." Bradley's face reddened, but he didn't respond. He got out of the car, yanked open Jamal's door, and grabbed his arm, pulling him out roughly. Jamal didn't resist, walking with his head held high as Bradley led him toward the station's entrance. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights made every bruise on Jamal's face stand out. The desk officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, looked up as they approached. "What's this?" the desk officer asked, his gaze flicking between Jamal and Bradley. His eyes lingered on Jamal's bruised jaw and bloody lip. "Resisting arrest," Bradley said curtly. "Assaulted me during a routine stop." Jamal let out a sharp laugh, drawing both men's attention. "You mean after you hit me first?" "Let's not leave that part out." The desk officer's brow furrowed. "What's he talking about?" Bradley bristled. "He's just trying to make excuses. Don't listen to him." Before the desk officer could respond, the sound of a phone buzzing broke the tension. Bradley fished his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. His face blanched slightly as he read the notification. "What is it?" the desk officer asked. Bradley shoved the phone back into his pocket. "Nothing. Just process him," he said, his tone clipped. The desk officer hesitated, but eventually gestured for Jamal to move toward the holding area. As Bradley turned to leave, Jamal spoke up, his voice loud and clear. "You know what that notification was, don't you?" Jamal said, his words carrying through the station. "It's the videos. They're already online." Bradley stopped mid-step, but didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed, and he stormed off down the hallway without another word. The desk officer looked back at Jamal, his expression now laced with suspicion. "What videos?" he asked. "The ones that show everything," Jamal replied, his tone firm. "You might want to check them before you take his word for it." The officer said nothing, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Jamal allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he was led toward the holding cell. Bradley's confidence was cracking, and Jamal knew this wasn't the end. Jamal sat in the cold, steel holding cell, the ache in his wrists from the cuffs only now beginning to subside. The station was eerily quiet, with only the occasional shuffle of footsteps or distant murmur of conversation breaking the silence. He leaned back against the wall, his bruised face throbbing as he replayed the events of the evening in his mind. He could still hear Bradley's threats echoing in his ears, but instead of fear, all he felt was determination. This time, it wouldn't be his word against an officer's. It would be his word and a crowd of video evidence. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open, and Jamal's attention snapped to the figure approaching. It wasn't Bradley, it was another officer, an older man with sharp eyes and a weary expression. His name tag read, Sergeant Daniels. "Carter," Daniels said, stopping in front of the cell. His tone was measured, neither friendly nor hostile. "You're Jamal Carter, right?" "That's me," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "What do you want?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down just outside the bars, his gaze fixed on Jamal. "I've been reviewing the preliminary report Bradley filed. He claims you resisted arrest and assaulted him." Jamal let out a sharp laugh. "Of course he does. Conveniently left out the part where he hit me first, didn't he?" Daniels tilted his head slightly. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact," Jamal said firmly, "and there's plenty of video to back it up. You might want to check Twitter or Facebook if you haven't already." Daniels raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal as though trying to size him up. "Tell me what happened," Daniels said finally. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then recounted the events of the evening, sparing no detail. He described the initial stop, Bradley's escalating hostility, the baton, and the punch that had started it all. Daniels listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Jamal finished, Daniels nodded slowly. "You're saying this was self-defense?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jamal replied. "And the videos will prove it." Daniels leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, Bradley's been with the force for over a decade. He's got a reputation, but not all of it's good. This isn't the first time someone's accused him of crossing the line." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Then why is he still here?" Daniels sighed, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor. "Because things like this tend to get swept under the rug. But that might not happen this time, depending on what those videos show." Before Jamal could respond, The door creaked open again. This time, Bradley stormed in, his face red with anger. "What are you doing in here, Daniels?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "This isn't your case." Daniels stood slowly, turning to face Bradley. "Just getting a better understanding of the situation." "I don't need your help," Bradley snapped. His gaze shifted to Jamal, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is going to save you? It won't. You're the one in the cell, not me." Jamal met his glare head-on, for now. "But I'm not the one all over social media right now either." Bradley's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might lash out again. But Daniels stepped between them, his tone firm. "Enough, Bradley. Let's talk outside." Bradley hesitated, then reluctantly followed Daniels out of the room. The door closed behind them, but their muffled voices carried through the thin walls. Jamal couldn't make out every word, but he caught enough to piece together the conversation. "Videos are everywhere," Daniels said, his tone calm but serious. Bradley's voice was louder, more frantic. "They don't show the whole story. You can't just take their word over mine." "You're not giving me much choice," Daniels replied. "Your version of events isn't holding up." The conversation ended abruptly, and a few minutes later, Daniels returned alone. He approached the cell, unlocking the door and gesturing for Jamal to follow. "You're being released," Daniels said. Jamal frowned. "What about Bradley?" Daniels's expression darkened. "That's being handled. For now, I suggest you go home and rest. But don't think this is over. There'll be an investigation, and you'll likely be called in to testify." Jamal stepped out of the cell, stretching his wrists as relief washed over him. "Fine by me. I've got nothing to hide." As Daniels escorted him toward the exit, Jamal caught sight of Bradley down the hallway, his face pale and his shoulders tense as he spoke with another officer. For the first time that night, Bradley looked unsure of himself, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of what was to come. Outside the station, the cool night air hit Jamal's face, soothing his bruises. A small group of people was gathered near the entrance, their phones still in hand. One man stepped forward, giving Jamal a nod. "We've got your back," the man said. "We're not letting this go." Jamal nodded in gratitude, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to a broken system and making sure no one else had to go through what he did. The next morning, Jamal sat at his kitchen table, his phone buzzing non-stop with notifications. News outlets had picked up the story, and the videos from last night had gone viral. Each clip showed the same thing: Officer Bradley swinging first, followed by Jamal defending himself. The hashtags #CharterTR Justice for Jamal and Ours Hold Bradley Accountable were trending across social media, with countless people weighing in on what had happened. Jamal scrolled through the posts, his emotions swinging between gratitude and frustration. Strangers from all over the country were calling for Bradley's suspension and an investigation, but he also saw plenty of people defending the officer, twisting the narrative to paint Jamal as the aggressor. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood cautiously, peeking through the window before opening it. Standing on his porch was a tall, middle-aged black woman holding a notepad and a press badge clipped to her blazer. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone professional but warm. "I'm Vanessa Reed, a reporter with the local paper. I'd like to talk to you about what happened last night." Jamal hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. "Come in," he said, gesturing toward the living room. "I guess you've seen the videos." Vanessa nodded as she took a seat. "I have, but I want to hear your side of the story directly." "People are listening, Mr. Carter, and your voice matters." Jamal sat across from her, folding his hands tightly. He recounted everything: how Bradley had stopped him for no reason, the escalating confrontation, and the moment things turned physical. He spoke clearly and honestly, his frustration evident but controlled. Vanessa listened intently, jotting down notes. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly. "Do you feel like this is part of a larger issue? That what happened to you isn't just about one bad officer?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "It's definitely bigger than Bradley. He's not the first cop to pull something like this, and he won't be the last. But this time, people are paying attention. That's what matters. Vanessa nodded, her expression serious. And what do you hope comes from this? Jamal exhaled deeply. Accountability. Not just for Bradley, but for the whole system that lets people like him get away with this. If the videos hadn't gone viral, I'd probably still be in a cell right now. Vanessa closed her notepad, giving him a small, encouraging smile. Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Carter. I'll make sure it's told truthfully. As Vanessa left, Jamal's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a blocked number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? The voice on the other end was low and threatening. You think you're smart, don't you? Trying to ruin a good cop's career. You don't know who you're messing with. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? The line went dead, but the unease lingered. He knew the voice wasn't Bradley's. It sounded older, more controlled. Jamal sat down, his mind racing. Bradley wasn't working alone. There were others protecting him, just like he'd said. Later that evening, Jamal sat on his couch, staring at his phone. The reporter's visit had left him feeling hopeful. But the threatening call was a stark reminder of the stakes. He wasn't just up against Bradley. He was up against an entire system that would do anything to protect itself. A notification popped up on his screen. An email from Vanessa Reed. It was a draft of the article she planned to publish. The headline read, Caught on Camera. One man's fight against police misconduct. Jamal skimmed through the text, nodding at how accurately she'd captured his story. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. People were watching, and the truth was spreading. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. Jamal stood on the steps of City Hall, the evening sky a canvas of fiery oranges and deep purples. A crowd of protesters filled the square below him, their signs declaring phrases like "Justice for Jamal" and "End police brutality." The energy was palpable, a mix of frustration, anger, and hope. Chanting rippled through the crowd, growing louder as Jamal stepped up to the microphone. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't a politician or an activist. He was a carpenter who'd been thrown into the spotlight because he refused to let injustice stand. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, black, white, and everything in between, he knew he couldn't stay silent. Jamal gripped the microphone, his knuckles white, and took a deep breath. The crowd quieted, the weight of their expectation pressing on him. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he could find the right words. Then he spoke. I didn't ask for any of this, he began, his voice steady but raw. I didn't ask to be stopped by a man who saw my skin color as a threat. I didn't ask to be hit, humiliated, or thrown in a cell for defending myself, and I didn't ask to have my life turned into a hashtag. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support like a wave pushing him forward. But I'm here now, Jamal continued, his voice rising, and I'm standing in front of all of you because what happened to me isn't just about me. It's about every black man and woman who's ever been stopped, questioned, or hurt for simply existing. It's about every time we've had to teach our children how to survive an encounter with people who are supposed to protect us. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Jamal's throat tightened, but he pushed through. We live in a world where my skin is seen as a weapon before I even open my mouth, where my rights only seem to matter when there's a camera rolling. And I know I'm not alone in that. Every single one of you out here tonight knows this fight. You've lived it, or you've watched someone you love live it. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. But let me tell you something. The fact that we're here tonight, standing together, means they haven't beaten us. It means that every time they try to silence us, we get louder. Every time they push us down, we rise up. The applause grew louder, the crowd cheering and chanting his name. This isn't about hating the police, Jamal said, his tone firm. It's about holding them accountable. It's about making sure they don't get to play by a different set of rules. And it's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. He took a step closer to the microphone, his voice softening, but no less powerful. I'm tired. We're all tired. But we can't afford to stop now, because every time we stand together, every time we say enough is enough, we're one step closer to the justice we deserve." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Jamal stepped back, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through him. He felt the weight of their hope, their belief. And for the first time in days, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. As the crowd began to disperse, Jamal stood off to the side, watching as people exchanged hugs and words of encouragement. A young woman approached him, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "What you said tonight, it gave me hope." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. "That's why I did it." Before she could respond, another voice cut through the din. "Mr. Carter!" It was Vanessa Reed, the reporter from earlier. She held her phone up, recording him as she approached. "That speech was incredible. Do you think it will have an impact?" Jamal hesitated, his gaze shifting to the crowd. "I hope so," he said finally. "But words alone won't change anything. It's what we do next that matters." Vanessa nodded, lowering her phone. "And what's next for you?" Jamal didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as he watched the crowd disperse, their determination etched on their faces, he knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over. The video of Jamal's speech spread quickly, shared on news outlets and social media platforms alike. It became a rallying cry, inspiring more protests across the city and sparking heated debates on national television. Some called Jamal a hero, a voice for justice in a system that often silenced people like him. Others painted him as a troublemaker, someone who had provoked a good officer just trying to do his job. Jamal sat in his living room, the glow of his phone screen reflecting off his face as he scrolled through the comments. They ranged from heartfelt messages of support to vile insults and threats. He clenched his jaw as he read one. "People like you don't belong in our neighborhoods. You got what you deserved." His phone buzzed with a call, and he answered without checking the number. "Carter," the voice on the other end said, its tone sharp and cold. "You need to back off." "Who is this?" Jamal demanded. "You think you can take this fight public and come out clean?" The voice continued, ignoring his question. "You're playing a dangerous game, and you're not gonna like how it ends." The line went dead. Jamal sat frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. He'd been receiving threats since the incident, but this one felt different, more direct, more personal. He set the phone down, his hands trembling slightly, but his resolve hardening. Later that evening, Vanessa Reed called to check in. "Jamal, have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "What now?" "There's been a statement from the police union," Vanessa said. "They're doubling down on Bradley's version of events, calling you a violent agitator." Jamal exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Of course they are. They can't admit he was wrong. It would crack the whole system." Vanessa hesitated. "The thing is, they're also pushing for charges against you. They're claiming the videos don't tell the full story." Jamal felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. "So now I'm the bad guy," he muttered. "You're not," Vanessa said firmly. "And the people know that. Stay strong, Jamal. This is exactly what they want, to scare you into backing down." The next day, Jamal joined another protest in the heart of the city. The turnout was larger than before, the crowd spilling into the streets with signs and chants demanding justice. As Jamal wove through the throng, he noticed a familiar face. Sergeant Daniels. Daniels wasn't in uniform. He stood on the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, watching quietly. Jamal hesitated before walking over to him. "Didn't expect to see you here," Jamal said. Daniels nodded slightly. "Didn't expect to be here, but after everything I've seen, I couldn't just stay quiet." Jamal studied the older man, his expression guarded. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means you were right," Daniels said, his voice low. "Bradley's got a history, and the department's been covering for him. It's bigger than one bad cop." The words hit Jamal harder than he expected. He'd always suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside brought a bitter mix of validation and anger. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Jamal asked, his tone challenging. Daniels's gaze hardened. What I can. But change doesn't happen overnight, Carter. You know that. It doesn't happen at all if people like you stay silent, Jamal shot back. Before Daniels could respond, the protest surged forward, the chants growing louder. Jamal was swept back into the crowd. The conversation left unfinished. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the protest turned tense. Police in riot gear formed a line at the edge of the square, their shields glinting in the fading light. Jamal stood near the front, his fists clenched, as the officers barked orders for the crowd to disperse. "We're not going anywhere," someone shouted, and the crowd roared in agreement. A bottle flew from somewhere in the back, shattering near the officers. The line shifted. Batons raised as the tension reached a boiling point. Jamal raised his hands, turning toward the crowd. "Don't give them an excuse," he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is what they want. They want us to lose control so they can call us the aggressors." The crowd hesitated, the energy shifting, but the standoff remained. The line between the protesters and the officers razor thin. In the chaos, Jamal caught sight of Bradley near the back of the police line. Their eyes met briefly, and Jamal saw the simmering hatred in the officer's glare. Bradley gestured toward him, saying something to another officer. Jamal felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. He didn't know what Bradley was planning, but he knew one thing. This fight was far from over. As the protest dragged into the evening, the tension in the air grew heavier. The chants of the crowd mixed with the sharp commands of the police, creating a cacophony that made it hard to think. Jamal stood firm, his eyes fixed on the line of officers in riot gear. He wasn't afraid, but he was wary. Too much had happened already, and he could feel something brewing just beneath the surface. A group of younger protesters near the front began shouting at the officers, their anger spilling over. One of them threw a plastic bottle, which bounced harmlessly off a shield. The reaction was immediate. The officers shifted, batons raised, the line tightening as though preparing to charge. "Stop!" Jamal shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He pushed his way forward, placing himself between the protesters and the officers. "We're not here to fight. Don't give them what they want." The younger protesters hesitated, their fury momentarily tempered by his presence. Jamal turned to face the officers, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. He locked eyes with one of them, a young man whose face was partially obscured by his helmet. The officer's grip on his baton wavered for a moment before he stepped back slightly, the tension in his posture easing. But not everyone was willing to de-escalate. From the back of the line, Bradley pushed his way forward, his eyes blazing with anger. He stopped just behind the line of shields, his gaze locked on Jamal. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Bradley spat, his voice dripping with venom. Jamal didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who started this. You are." The two men stared at each other, the weight of their shared animosity almost palpable. Around them, the crowd grew quieter, sensing the confrontation. Phones were raised, cameras capturing every moment. "You're not a hero," Bradley continued, his voice rising. "You're just a thug, pretending to be a victim." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "And you're just a bully with a badge. The difference is, I'm not hiding who I am." Bradley stepped forward, his hand dropping to the baton at his side. Before he could make another move, another officer grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Stand down, Bradley," the officer muttered, his voice low but firm. "This isn't over," Bradley growled, shaking off the officer's grip. Jamal turned his attention back to the crowd, his voice steady, but loud enough to carry. "This isn't about him. It's about us. About standing together and demanding change. Don't let him distract you from that." The crowd erupted into cheers, the tension dissipating slightly. Jamal stepped back, his heart pounding as the standoff continued. The line of officers didn't move, but their presence remained a looming threat. As the night wore on, the protesters began to disperse, their energy spent, but their resolve unbroken. Jamal lingered near the edge of the square, watching as the crowd thinned. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sergeant Daniels. "You handled yourself well out there," Daniels said, his tone neutral. Jamal crossed his arms. Didn't have much of a choice. If I didn't, someone else would have gotten hurt. Daniels nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Bradley's going to keep pushing. You know that, right? I figured as much, Jamal replied. But he's not the only one I'm up against. Daniels sighed, looking around the nearly empty square. There's pressure coming from above. They're trying to protect him, but the videos are making it harder. Don't think for a second that means they'll stop. Jamal studied the older man, trying to gauge his sincerity. So why are you telling me this? Because I've seen this department protect the wrong people for too long, Daniels said quietly. You have the public's attention now. Don't let it go to waste. Jamal nodded slowly, appreciating the sentiment, but unsure if he could fully trust the man in front of him. Thanks for the advice, he said finally. Daniels offered a small nod before turning and walking away. Jamal watched him go, the weight of the night settling over him like a heavy blanket. When Jamal returned home, he found a thick envelope taped to his front door. He glanced around cautiously before opening it. Inside was a stack of grainy photos, surveillance shots of him with his family, at his job, at the protests. A single note was tucked between the images. Back off. This is your last warning. Jamal's stomach churned, but his resolve only hardened. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The days following the protest were a whirlwind. The videos from the standoff had gone viral, further inflaming the public discourse. Jamal found himself at the center of a growing movement, but with every step forward, the pressure mounted. He knew the threats wouldn't stop, but he also knew he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. Vanessa Reed called one morning with urgent news. Jamal, they're moving forward with charges against you. Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest. The works. Jamal sat down heavily at his kitchen table, gripping the phone tightly. They're really doubling down on this, huh? Even with all the evidence out there? They're claiming the videos don't show the full context, Vanessa said. But here's the thing. They've also opened an internal investigation into Bradley. That's not public yet, but it means there's pressure on both sides. Jamal exhaled slowly. So they're trying to scapegoat me while quietly cleaning up their mess. Pretty much, Vanessa replied. But you've got people in your corner. Civil rights attorneys are offering to represent you pro bono, and the public's not letting this go. A trial might be exactly what we need to expose everything. Later that afternoon, Jamal met with one of the attorneys, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel Harper. She spread a stack of documents across his dining table, her expression serious. They've officially charged you, Rachel said, sliding a copy of the complaint toward him. This is their attempt to save face, but it's risky. If we play this right, we can not only clear your name, but also force the department to answer for its actions. And if we don't play it right? Jamal asked. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. Then they make you the fall guy, and Bradley walks away clean. But I'm not about to let that happen. As the weeks passed, preparations for the trial began. Rachel worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and crafting a narrative that countered the department's claims. Vanessa's articles kept the public engaged, and the protests continued to grow, adding pressure on the city to act. Jamal spent his days balancing hope and dread. Every news segment about the case brought a new wave of anxiety, but every message of support reminded him why he was fighting. One evening, as he scrolled through the countless messages on social media, he paused on a video from a teenager who had attended one of the protests. In the video, the boy held up a sign that read, "Jamal Carter gave me the courage to stand up." The boy's voice trembled as he spoke. "Because of him, I'm not afraid to speak out anymore. If he can fight, so can I." Jamal leaned back in his chair, the weight of the fight momentarily lifting. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who believed in change. The day of the trial arrived faster than Jamal expected. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters, their chants filling the air as he made his way inside. Rachel walked beside him, her presence steadying. Inside the courtroom, Bradley sat at the defendant's table, his jaw tight and his eyes avoiding Jamal's. His attorney was already flipping through documents, their strategy clear: paint Jamal as a violent aggressor and downplay Bradley's actions as justified. The prosecution opened with their narrative, showing the grainy body cam footage and arguing that Jamal had resisted from the start. But Rachel was ready. She countered with the viral videos, presenting them frame by frame to highlight Bradley's aggression. Witness after witness took the stand. Bystanders from the night of the confrontation testified about what they saw, their accounts consistent and damning for Bradley. One of the younger protesters, a girl no older than 16, described how Jamal had de-escalated the crowd when tensions were high. "He told us not to give them an excuse," she said, her voice clear. "He wasn't violent. He was protecting us." The turning point came when Rachel called her sergeant Daniels to the stand. Daniels, dressed in a crisp suit, looked uncomfortable, but resolute. Rachel's questioning was sharp, cutting through any hesitation. "Sergeant, you've been with the department for over 20 years, correct?" Rachel began. "Yes," Daniels replied. "And in that time, have you ever encountered complaints about Officer Bradley's conduct?" Daniels hesitated, glancing briefly at the judge before answering. "Yes." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "How many complaints, Sergeant?" "Several," Daniels admitted. "There were reports of excessive force and misconduct." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the tension thick enough to cut. Rachel pressed on. "And what actions were taken in response to these complaints?" Daniels's jaw tightened. "They were reviewed, but no disciplinary action was taken." Rachel stepped closer to the witness stand, her voice rising slightly. "So the department knew about Bradley's behavior and did nothing. And now my client is being blamed for defending himself against an officer with a documented history of abuse." The judge rapped his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Daniels's testimony had cracked the defense's case wide open. As the trial continued, Jamal felt a sense of momentum building. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the trial neared its conclusion. The prosecution had delivered its final arguments, doubling down on the claim that Jamal had escalated the confrontation and that Bradley's actions were necessary to maintain control. But Rachel Harper was ready, her calm confidence cutting through the tension like a scalpel as she rose to deliver her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rachel began, her voice steady, "this case is not just about the actions of my client, Jamal Carter. It's about a system that has allowed misconduct to go unchecked, and an officer who believed his badge gave him the right to violate the very laws he swore to uphold." She turned to the jury, her expression firm but empathetic. "You saw the videos. You heard the testimony. Jamal Carter was not the aggressor. He was a man walking to his truck after a hard day's work, stopped without cause, harassed, and ultimately assaulted by someone who should have protected him." Rachel gestured toward Bradley, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his face pale. "Officer Bradley has a history of excessive force. His own superior admitted under oath that complaints were ignored. This trial is not just about clearing my client's name, it's about holding those in power accountable." Her gaze swept across the room, landing on each juror in turn. "Today, you have a choice. You can uphold the truth, or you can send a message that the badge is above the law. I urge you to choose justice." She returned to her seat, her expression calm but purposeful. Jamal glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, but his nerves were far from settled. Now, all they could do was wait. The deliberation lasted for hours. Jamal paced the courthouse hallways, his mind racing with every possible outcome. Supporters gathered outside, their chants of "Justice for Jamal" echoing faintly through the walls. Rachel stayed close, her calm demeanor steadying him as they waited for the verdict. Finally, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. Jamal's heart pounded as he took his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, and the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. In the matter of the charges against Jamal Carter, the foreperson began, her voice clear, we find the defendant not guilty. The words hit Jamal like a wave, relief washing over him as the weight of the charges lifted. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Rachel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's not over yet, she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Bradley. The judge called for order as the next phase of the trial began. The proceedings against Bradley. The charges of misconduct and excessive force were now front and center, and Rachel was prepared to take the offensive. She questioned every witness, dissected every piece of evidence, and painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his power with impunity. Bradley took the stand reluctantly, his demeanor defiant, but increasingly cornered under Rachel's relentless questioning. Officer Bradley, she said, her tone sharp, you testified that you felt threatened by Mr. Carter. Can you explain why a man walking to his truck posed such a danger to you? Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the jury. He was uncooperative, he muttered. He refused to comply. Rachel arched an eyebrow. And in your mind, noncompliance justified hitting him with a baton and punching him in the face? I didn't hit him without cause, Bradley shot back, his voice rising. He resisted. Resisted what? Rachel pressed, stepping closer to the stand. Your attempt to violate his rights? Your assumption that he was a threat because of the color of his skin? The judge rapped his gavel, but the damage was done. Bradley's face reddened as Rachel stepped back, letting the jury absorb the weight of her words. The final moments of the trial were a blur. The defense's attempts to salvage Bradley's case fell flat, their arguments unraveling under the weight of evidence and testimony. When the verdict came, it was swift and decisive. We find the defendant, Officer Bradley, guilty of misconduct and excessive use of force. The words sent a ripple through the courtroom, followed by cheers from the crowd outside. Jamal felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest as he watched Bradley slump in his seat, his once defiant posture crumbling under the weight of the decision. As the court adjourned, Jamal stepped outside into the sunlight, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. Vanessa was there, her camera rolling as she approached him. How does it feel to finally have justice? She asked, her microphone poised. Jamal paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It's a start, he said. But justice isn't just about one trial or one verdict. It's about changing the system that let this happen in the first place. That fight isn't over. The crowd erupted into cheers again, their chants of justice for Jamal ringing out louder than ever. Jamal stood tall, his resolve unshaken. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. As the crowd outside the courthouse swelled, their chants of justice for Jamal reverberating through the city streets, Jamal stood near the steps, letting their energy wash over him. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of uncertainty lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. Bradley's conviction and sentencing were monumental, but Jamal knew this wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that had been exposed for what it was, a system that had to change. Rachel Harper joined him, her expression calm but reflective. You did it, Jamal. This is going to make waves. Jamal shook his head slightly. We did it. And it's a start. But there's still so much to do. Rachel smiled faintly. You've sparked something bigger than any of us, but don't forget to take a moment to breathe. Jamal nodded, appreciating her words but knowing rest would have to wait. He descended the courthouse steps, greeted by handshakes, hugs, and words of encouragement. People from all walks of life had gathered here. Young activists, seasoned community leaders, and even families with children holding handmade signs. Each of them was a reminder of why this fight mattered. Vanessa Reed, standing with her camera crew, approached him once again. Jamal, the city is listening. What's your message to the people who are still on the fence, who think this fight isn't their fight? Jamal paused, gathering his thoughts before speaking. To anyone who thinks this isn't their fight, I get it. It's easy to look away when it doesn't affect you directly, but injustice anywhere affects us all. If we don't stand together, we're just letting the same systems divide us. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and the only way we change that is by staying loud and staying united. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing across the plaza. Vanessa lowered her microphone, clearly moved by his words. In the days that followed, the momentum didn't wane. The city council introduced sweeping reforms, spurred on by the pressure from protests and public outcry. A civilian oversight board was officially established, and independent investigators began reviewing the complaints that had long been buried in the department's files. The police chief, who had previously defended Bradley, announced his resignation amid growing scrutiny. Jamal, though still at the center of the movement, started to find moments of peace. One evening, he returned to his workshop, the place that had always brought him solace. The smell of wood and sawdust filled the air as he sanded the edges of a custom table, the rhythmic motion grounding him. It was the first time in weeks he'd felt something close to normalcy. As he worked, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from one of the young activists he'd met at the protest. "Your strength gave us the courage to keep going. Thank you for showing us what's possible." Jamal set the phone down, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't set out to become a symbol, but if his fight could inspire others, then it was worth every sleepless night, every moment of fear. Months later, Jamal stood in the same square where the largest protest had taken place. This time, it wasn't for a march or a rally, but for a community celebration, marking the first tangible steps of reform. Families gathered, children ran through the square, and local musicians played upbeat tunes that carried through the crisp air. Vanessa Reed was there, documenting the event, and Rachel Harper stood off to the side, chatting with other community leaders. Sergeant Daniels approached Jamal quietly, his hands in his pockets. "You've done something remarkable," Daniels said, his voice low. "Not just for yourself, but for this city." Jamal turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who refused to stay silent." Daniels nodded, then extended his hand. "I'll keep doing what I can on my end, but if you ever need someone on the inside, you know where to find me." Jamal shook his hand, appreciating the gesture, but knowing the road ahead would require more than individual promises. It would take sustained effort from everyone, inside and out. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Jamal stepped onto a makeshift stage. The crowd quieted as he approached the microphone, their attention fully on him. "Tonight isn't just about what we've done," Jamal began, his voice carrying through the square. "It's about what we're going to do. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen all at once, but we've proven that when we stand together, we're unstoppable." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This fight isn't over. It's not going to be over until justice isn't something we have to demand. It's something that's guaranteed for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. Jamal stepped back from the microphone, letting their voices fill the square. He felt a profound sense of purpose, knowing that while the fight wasn't over, they had taken the first steps together. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt hope, not just for himself, but for a future where justice wasn't a battle, but a given. I hope that this story impacted you in some way. If it did, then watch these 2 videos that I handpicked for you.